Hi, and welcome to Books and Beyond. I'm Jimmy Bennett. I'm your host. This week, I have a very special guest, but before I get to him, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the Southeastern Connecticut CAPA organization. That stands for Connecticut Authors and Publishers Association. We're a group of writers, illustrators, editors, publishers. We meet once a month via Zoom now, obviously, during the crisis, at 6:30 on the third Monday of every month. You can go to the Southeastern Connecticut CAPA page on Facebook and get the link. We invite anybody to join in. Hope you'll come and check us out. So I myself am an author also. I have 3 books I call the William Gillette series, written about the Gillette's Castle down in East Haddam and William Gillette, the man who brought Sherlock Holmes to America. They're historical mysteries, fiction. They're available on Amazon and at Bank Square Books. I hope you'll check them out. And in my course of, I'm also the co-chairperson of the Southeastern Connecticut CAPA group. And through the group, I met a very special man who I've become friends with, William Curatolo. William, how are you?
Oh, very good, thanks. I'm in my 5th month of confinement.
Yeah, you hanging in there? You've been you've been very reclusive, haven't you?
Well, yeah, what can I say? I'm 71 years old, although I don't look it, and I'm just being careful. I mean, I'm retired, so I don't have to go out to work, and I'm pretty adept with a computer, so I'm in contact with a lot of people, and luckily through Zoom, there are a lot of things I used to go down to New York City for that I can now do sitting in my house. So things are good.
I have to admit that's Zoom is that one technology that really has made things nice for a lot of people. I enjoy it. It's fun to do the show in the studio, but it's nice to be able to do the show from home. It's nice to be able to connect to people at home, see them, talk to them. Real Star Trek stuff. I love it.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you. I used to go down once a month to some science lectures at City University of New York, and it would involve 45-minute drive to New Haven, two hours on Metro North, then a half an hour on the subway, and then come back. Now I can do it right here.
Right. I know, you gotta love it. You gotta love it.
Yeah.
So, Bill, you were a research scientist at Pfizer's. Then you retired, and so tell me, how did your experiences, come about building a writing career?
I've thought about this. This has forced me to think a little bit about this, and I basically, people say write what you know, and a lot of what I write doesn't really require a lot of imagination. I write a lot from my experience, and I just thought I'd tell you a few things. I started life in Queens, New York, in a working class neighborhood, and luckily I went to a parochial school where the nuns beat grammar into me. So I learned to write, and went to high school in Astoria, Queens, got into music, then went to college in the Bronx. I majored in electrical engineering because I had sort of the working class attitude, which was, well, you don't go away to college, that's wasteful. And you major in something that'll get you a job when you're done, and those sorts of things. I continued an interest in music. In college, actually, I was in a folk singing group, but I actually played at the bitter end in Greenwich Village a couple of times.
Oh, wow.
I like to tell people that's where Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul, and Mary got their start, and where I got my finish. So anyway, I had lots of jobs through college, and for a year after college, I was a mailman. I worked in a truck distribution center. That was what was called a shape-up job in Queens, where people stole things every night. And I was a mail van driver doing a midnight run up to Fishkill, New York while I was in school. I worked at the Hellgate Power Plant in the South Bronx. I was an industrial spy. We can talk about that later if you want. And I was a vegetable man at the A&P. So I have a lot of these sort of experiences that were sort of related to growing up in my neighborhood. But after I finished college, I decided I didn't want to be an electrical engineer. I moved to Boston, and I went to grad school in biochemistry at Boston University Medical School. And that was sort of a new start for me. I really loved it. Then I had a job at MIT for 2 years and worked with a Nobel laureate. Then I had a faculty position for 4 years. And I wrote a lot. I wrote a lot of science papers. At the same time, I always carried around, I think I've showed you this before, from the time I started college, I carried around a little book in which I would just make little notes about what I observed, things I overheard in airports that people didn't know I was overhearing, ideas, things from the radio, things like that. And all these things put together sort of provided a whole lot of background for writing. In any case, 1983, I ended up leaving academia and took a job at Pfizer in R&D in Groton, Connecticut. And that's probably, the day I walked into Pfizer, I think of as, it might be it was definitely one of the luckiest days of my life. I just had terrific colleagues, terrific resources, worked on incredibly interesting projects. It was just very productive. I worked on formulation of drugs, and I got to see the world too. You know, I spent a lot of time in Bend, Oregon. We had collaborators in Bend, Oregon, and I got to spend a lot of time out there. And so when I never really knew if I would ever actually write anything in terms of fiction, but I was always taking notes. And I guess you could say I was sort of a dreamer. You know, I thought, well, maybe someday I'd do it. And during the last few years when I was at Pfizer, I started to just write individual chapters that were related to things I'd heard about. And, you know, I'd seen a lot of unusual things. You know, I knew about a small company that did clinical trials in Central America, where it turns out that there were patients that were totally imaginary and data was made up. I got to go to, because of my job, I got to go to Kuala Lumpur and Borneo and learn a little bit about how drugs and drug regulations are dealt with in those places. So what happened was I started to put these things together in little chapters, never knowing how I would put it together, and then never knowing how it would end up. And then I started to think about my early days working in the truck distribution center. And when I did that, again, this was in college, and I said it was a shape-up job. He's now gone, but my friend's father would get us this job, and we'd work overnight. And at about midnight, when it was lunch hour, he and his brother-in-law would pay off the guard, and every day they'd fill up their 2 cars with whatever they considered to be the most fensible items. So I thought a lot about this truck thievery. And so I kind of put all this stuff together and thought up a couple of characters, and all of a sudden I had my first book. And you know, I published that maybe 3 years after I left Pfizer. I published that back in 2013. So that's kind of how I got to writing. I had to learn a lot along the way, and I certainly didn't do it in any, I didn't do it with a lot of forethought. I did it sort of spare time until the very end when you have to actually finish something.
Right.
Yeah.
So you started writing after you retired?
Well, no. Like I'd say for the last few years I was at Pfizer, because of what had happened to my job, I was spending a lot of time on planes and trains. And I started to write snippets, and I started to write chapters. And it didn't actually come together till after I left, but I probably had at least 1/3 of my first book written by then.
Okay.
But by the time I retired, and when I retired from Pfizer, I went on to be a consultant. I did a lot of expert witness work for law firms having to do with patent litigation.
Oh.
And that's really when I spent a lot of time on planes and trains, and that's when I probably did a lot of focused writing. I have a hard time with distractions.
Yeah.
So if you're on a train for 2 hours, if you're on a plane for 6 hours, I could really focus, and that's pretty much where I wrote most of the first book.
Wow. So what was the name of your first book?
It's called Campanellismo, and it's about the drug. It takes place in the drug industry, and people always wonder about the name. In the beginning of the book, I state exactly what it is. Campanellismo is this Italian philosophy of life that says that everything important in your life takes place in the area from which you can see the bell tower of your town. The bell tower is the campanile in Italian. And the idea was that everybody in the book was very provincial, and they were just working to maximize their own self-interest. And that kind of explains how everybody was behaving, no matter how complicated the situations were. So in that book, it's really about two men who are very different. One of them is from a New Jersey mafia family who went to Rutgers University and majored in Italian history, but got dragged into the family business and was managing a trucking warehouse that was essentially a truck hijacking operation. He gets out, and then he starts an internet pharmacy because he sees an opportunity there, and he illegally sells drugs online. That's something another thing I learned a lot about at Pfizer. I had spent some time towards the end working on analysis of drugs from other countries that were imitations of Pfizer drugs that were quite impure. So that's another thing in my background that I knew something about. So I really knew a lot about these internet pharmacies. And so there's two characters. He's the main character. The other main character is a guy from the Bronx, another Italian American, who has a PhD in biology and works in a large drug company in New Jersey. And these two guys interact. In a variety of ways. They interact in good ways and in very bad ways. And it's a thriller. People get killed, and it takes place in New Jersey, Kuala Lumpur, and Borneo. So you can see how a lot of things in my background ended up getting dumped in this book. But I think it's a pretty exciting book. It and my second book have something that I really like in thrillers, which is I like to learn about stuff. So if there's background information about a field I don't know anything about, I really like that. I learned in writing you can overdo that, so I had to pull back a lot. But an example, a good example would be Robin Cook. Robin Cook is a writer who I like a lot. Well, his book Coma takes place a lot in an operating room. Well, I didn't know anything about hospital operating rooms, and I just loved learning about that stuff.
And you put a lot of fact into your books.
Yeah, but I learned there's nothing like good critique from people. I had some pretty didactic chapters in this first book, and a couple of friends said, "You just got to take that stuff out." People are looking for action if you're writing a thriller. And what I learned, I got much better in the second book, but I'll still say I think the first book is pretty good. I learned to sort of mix this information in as things go along as necessary. But when I really, this gets into how difficult was it to actually learn how to write fiction. This gets into sort of one issue that a lot of people have to deal with, which is I had the idea, well, for people to understand what's really going on in this story, I have to teach them something about the drug industry, and that was just wrong. You know, you get a couple of chapters of teaching and you just close the book and put it away. You know, if you want a textbook, you go get a textbook. So people who critiqued my first draft were very helpful with that. And then I just mixed in the stuff. And one person who read the book said, I'm really amazed. You managed to discuss all of drug development in two paragraphs. So
and I can see where you have such a diverse background. I mean, be honest with you, Bill, I've known you for a while now, and I never knew that you went to school to be an electrical engineer. I always assumed that you were in the sciences, in the research field. You know, so I think that's probably what's going to make your novel so vibrant. You know, which makes it so realistic.
Right. I won't get into why I left electrical engineering. You know,
Yeah. But
these are the stories of your youth. You know, but you know, luckily, I think a lot of times you get very lucky, and you don't go down a predetermined path because something happens, but another path opens up that's much, much better.
Yep.
And that's the way I look at the electrical engineering thing. You know, my father didn't go to college. My mother didn't go to college. Their advice was, well, don't go away to college. That's a waste of money. And major in engineering because you want a good job. And I didn't really think too much about that. It just made sense. But then I became interested in basic science. And now I write fiction.
Yep. So tell me about your second book.
The second book is called Too Many Hats, Herbal Medicine and the Mob. And it involves the two major characters of the first book, but you don't need to read the first book to read the second book at all. And what happened was I found myself in my car a lot on Saturdays and Sundays doing errands. And being from New York City, I would listen to AM talk radio from New York City. And on Saturdays and Sundays, there were these endless infomercials about herbal remedies, you know, various herbs that will cure your diabetes or cure your heart disease or whatever. And I became very skeptical about it. And then I just started investigating it. And I became sort of a bit obsessed with this. I read a lot about their interactions with the FDA and all sorts of these things. And then it occurred to me, it would be interesting if one of the characters that I had became obsessed with bringing down herbal remedy con men. So the second book involves the same two characters who were the major characters of the first book, but they now have a biotech company that they run together. The one guy, the guy who had been from the New Jersey mob, he plowed all this money he made from the illegal internet pharmacies into this biotech company, and it's a research company. And then the head of research is this other guy who I mentioned before, who was from the Bronx, who was a biologist who used to work in a big drug company. And what happens is they both get involved in peripheral activities that are self-destructive for them. And I think that's always interesting. I think it's always interesting when sort of flawed characters make mistakes. And so one character, the guy who's the head of the company, the guy who had the money, he gets called back into the mob to help them oversee all their legitimate businesses. I'm not going to tell you the whole book, but this will give you a feeling for it. And whereas his partner at the same time is becoming obsessed with these herbal remedy companies and starts a blog and starts to try to bring them down. And what happens is the mob has some legitimate businesses that are herbal remedy companies. So you got these two partners who all of a sudden become enemies in this situation. And the book is about how this all turns out. And again, people get killed.
Yeah. It must be, did you do a lot of research into the herbal medicines and stuff that you see? I mean, it's always been kind of, I don't know, interesting to me. Just, I'm not one to do it. I got enough pills I got to take every day, you know.
Right.
But to see all these different companies putting out all this stuff and all this advertising, making all these claims, which if they were true, I mean, we'd all be healthy as ox. We'd all be Adonises. So how much of that did you look into?
A lot. I spent a lot of time looking into that. And it's very interesting. What I learned was truth is stranger than fiction. Because there are cases, these tend to, the most egregious cases happen to be in the erectile dysfunction area and in the muscle building area for weightlifters and people like that. And what there have been is that there have been numerous cases of so-called herbal products that are spiked with real drugs. And not only are they spiked with real drugs, they're spiked with really badly impure real drugs. And the FDA has been after these people, and it's been very interesting. So that's one thing. That's pretty extreme. But the other thing that I learned about was, here's an example. The New York State Department of Health decided to take a whole series of herbal medicines, although they don't call them medicines because they don't cure disease. They don't treat disease. They do things like they help the sugar levels in your blood, or they help your heart. Well, I'd say a Milky Way helps your heart too because it provides some sustenance. But anyway, okay, New York State Department of Health, and by the way, I could go off on a tangent here and finish the half hour, so I'll just stop after this one story. The New York State Department of Health gathered 30 different herbal remedies from health food stores, and they just analyzed what was in them. And this was truth being stranger than fiction. In 2/3 of the remedies they bought in health food stores, in 2/3 of them, they did not even contain the herb that was said to be the active herb.
Oh my
Forget
God.
about whether it would work if it was there. They didn't even contain it. And then, so I provided an example like this in the book. One of the things that the character, who's the blogger, uncovers. I said that he analyzed something like 30 different herbal remedies and found that 1/3 didn't contain the so-called active herb. Because I thought if I said 2/3 didn't contain the so-called active herb, it would just sound too crazy. It couldn't possibly be true. But that was the number. So anyway, yes, I became sort of obsessed with this, but the book isn't really about that. The book, Too Many Hats, is really about the interaction of these two collaborators and friends who all of a sudden find themselves on opposite sides of an argument. And it involves the government and the FDA and of course the Jersey mob.
Right. So now also I know too, I know this for a fact because I've read a few. Aside from writing your novels, you also write short stories or articles for magazines.
Yeah, that's another thing I started. It's funny. It's funny how life is. I thought, I know a lot of little quirky scientific things that might be interesting to people, and they might also be interesting to mystery writers and people who just like quirky things. And I thought, well, if I publish some of those, maybe people will become aware of my books and buy the books, the novels. And I tried getting into places, and magazines are very difficult to get into. And then I belong to a group called the Wolf Pack in New York City, which is the fans of the Nero Wolfe books, and they have a banquet every year. And I was at the banquet, and I saw a guy up at the bar who was who I knew was the editor of Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine. So I just went up, introduced myself, talked to him, and he said he'd be interested. So anyway, that's how I get into that. But what these are is short, maybe 3-page pieces on they're nonfiction, on quirky things. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And I try to relate them to a Sherlock Holmes story if I can. Well, but one of them is about poisonous quail. You know, quail eat seeds of poisonous plants, and sometimes of the year in certain parts of the world, quail are poisonous. So there's one about that. I wrote one about how the poison ricin works. You might have heard, you know, there's this famous case of Georgy Markov, the Bulgarian dissident, about 20 years ago, who was stabbed with an umbrella device in the back of his leg in London, and it left a little pellet of ricin in him that killed him. So I wrote a little piece about how ricin works. I wrote one about man-eating plants because
that was a fun one. I read that one.
Yeah, Arthur Conan Doyle. He before he wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, he published some short stories. Some of them were pretty bad, but one of them is called The American's Tale. And in The American's Tale, a cowboy out west gets killed by a giant man-eating plant, a giant Venus flytrap. So, you know, I just thought, well, that's a connection to Sherlock Holmes. So, at least to Arthur Conan Doyle. So I wrote one on that. I have two more that will come out when the magazine, when the COVID epidemic's over or whatever.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
One on trials by ordeal. You know, in the Middle Ages, they used to do trials where you'd dip your hand in a boiling cauldron of water and, you know, and pull something out. And if you didn't heal in 2 days, you were guilty. Well, that's a very interesting subject. And that relates to a Sherlock Holmes novel called A Study in Scarlet. And then the other one I have is I did one on taste masking poisons. You know, if you wanted to feed somebody a poison, how could you taste mask it? And I did that because there's a Sherlock Holmes, a very famous Sherlock Holmes story called The Adventure of Silver Blaze, in which some poison is put in curried mutton.
Yep.
So you can imagine curry, you know, would definitely cover the taste of something. And so because I worked in the drug industry, I'm very aware of taste masking strategies. Because
hey, yeah. Well, actually, Bill, we're running out of time here. I'm sorry. Where are your books available?
On Amazon.
Okay.
And yeah, Campanellismo is, well, you look up my name, William Curatolo, or Campanellismo, or Too Many Hats, and they're available both as paperbacks and Kindles.
Oh, thank you so much. Bill, thank you for being a guest. I just want to say one thing before we get off the air here. In this crisis, you know, I know a lot of people have been sitting home. They've been watching a lot of TV. There's so many streaming services. It seems to binge watching shows, this and that. But I want to encourage you to read, because as you can see from my guest today, when you read, you ingest knowledge. You get to experience so many things: travel, mystery, suspense, excitement, facts, put to you in a fun way. And you really take it in. You can experience it on a deep and personal level. TV pretty much just throws up on you. So that's all we have today for Books and Beyond. Please tune in next time. Thank you very much. And special thanks to my guest, William Curatolo, and hope we'll have him back again. Take care.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks.